Felicia Gray, the illegitimate daughter of a count, with a difficult childhood and a happy future. A girl gifted with the gift of magical powers will become a beautiful lady and an excellent sorceress. Count Green is the head of the family. He is precisely the father of Felicia Gray. Felicia was an outcast in the family, which is why she had to defend herself. She often opened her mouth to justify herself and her actions. But at the dinner table there were always stronger relatives. For example, one of them was Count Carter Dalton's eldest son. Sitting at the common table, Carter always tried to offend Felicia, reminding the girl of her origins. Felicia Gray, a 10-year-old child gifted with a magical ability. She is only 10 years old for now. But the future is not far away, and Felicia Gray will definitely become a great and powerful sorceress. Fate, the villain, will set traps on Felicia's life path. The girl will not meet the love of her life, but will become a destroyer of someone else's happiness. Felicia will intervene in the fate of the Emperor and the Saint. Felicia will attempt to destroy the happiness of the two lovers. For what to pay with one's life? Felicia's head will be severed, and her heart ripped from her chest. Felicia Gray's soul will fall into terrible darkness and will suffer there eternally. Here is the destiny that a 10-year-old girl prophesied for herself, gazing at the reflection of her beautiful eyes in a porcelain teacup. Count Gray's story about the Northern War brought Felicia back to reality. At the dinner table, everyone listened attentively to the father. The Count continued. He reported that on the northern front line the battle against the monsters had failed, and the army was asking the Count to send a mage from his family to save the troops. The Count's elder children received this news without any particular desire to help the Empire. The question was serious, and the defense of the imperial lands was a matter of honor for the Gray family, but of the 4 children of Count Gray, none wished to take part in the war. Felicia is the youngest child of the Count, an illegitimate girl child, and the other brothers and sister did not consider Felicia a legitimate heir. That did not prevent Carter from raising his hand for Felicia and informing his father that the girl wanted to take part in the war. Count Gray was delighted beyond measure. The problem with the wizard was solved. Carter's elder brother tried to grab Felicia by the hand. The sister looked sternly at Felicia, asserting that her father's decision was correct and that no one else from their family could go to war. The middle brother, Darren Dalton, spoke out in support of his father's decision. Felicia was surprised by such an unfair decision of her family. The girl was upset. Tears welled up in the child's eyes. Felicia spent her entire childhood in the attic. The girl was constantly scolded and no one ever taught her magic. But Felicia was a very smart child, and at night in her room she was alone with books. Felicia watched the reaction of her relatives. The brothers were whispering something to each other. Felicia realized the purpose for which she had been invited to this family dinner. The girl had no choice left. Felicia agreed to leave her father's house. The girl, reborn as the main heroine Felicia of the novel, knew the unfortunate fate of the heroine all too well. She knew that in this house without care, love, and affection, Felicia would grow up to be a very bad person, and ultimately the girl would perish. The decision to leave the house was final. Felicia looked at her family for the last time. The castle of the Northern Duke Alan Hayes greeted with its might and chill. Little Felicia Gray walked along the huge corridors of the castle with her eyes wide open from fear and curiosity. The loyal assistant of the Duke, Duncan, accompanied the girl, holding her little hand tightly in his hands. Duncan ordered the girl not to be afraid. Felicia calmed down. The huge door to the Duke's throne room did not seem impregnable. But at one command from Duncan, the door swung open, and Felicia's eyes widened at the sight of the magnificent splendor. The Duke of the North, Alan Hayes, was shocked by what he saw. He did not expect that the powerful family of mages would send him a 10-year-old girl. Felicia did not look away and stood confidently before the Duke. The Duke of the Northern Lands, Alan Hayes, will play a very important role in Felicia's life. The Duke will save the main hero in a terrible battle. The girl bowed her head before the Duke and introduced herself. Duke Alan was upset by Count Gray's deed. He wanted to see a real wizard, not a child. Duncan was also surprised. He did not know how to respond to this to the Duke. Felicia closed her eyes. She was listening carefully to what these adult men were saying. Seated on an icy throne, Duke Alan perfectly understood the utter uselessness of a child on the battlefield. Felicia, awaiting the Duke's decision, looked at him with sad eyes. The Duke leaned towards the girl and told her that she was going home. Alan was merciless. The decision was made. Felicia looked at the Duke and waited for a different decision. Felicia tried to explain why her older brothers and sister could not take part in the war, but it seems these arguments only angered the Duke even more. The Duke's decision did not change. He leaned over the child. Felicia tearfully begged not to be sent back. The Duke stopped listening to the girl, turned around and left the hall. Felicia could not retreat. She knew perfectly well that she had nowhere to return. The girl ran after the Duke and asked to give her a chance to visit the battlefield. The Duke looked at Felicia distrustfully, and Felicia continued to persuade Alan. Felicia had to stay in the northern castle at all costs. She wanted to save money during the war and then leave the northern lands and live a carefree life in the countryside. Felicia did not let go of the Duke, continuing to prove that she possessed magical abilities. The girl looked at the adult man with eyes that were not at all childlike. Alan Hayes stopped and decided to listen carefully to the child. Duncan also froze in anticipation of the Duke's decision. Felicia, placing her hand on her chest, asked for only one thing: to go out onto the battlefield once. The girl's words were convincing, and the Duke made a decision that surprised the faithful Duncan. The Duke allowed Felicia to stay. His hand waved over the girl's head. Felicia was grateful to the Duke for the opportunity provided. Alan Hayes extended his hand to Felicia and announced his decision. The Duke reported that in 2 days Felicia would find herself on the battlefield, after which the Duke would make a decision. The northern lands were harsh. The snowy blizzard covered everything around. Duncan escorted the girl to her room and returned to his master. A serious conversation took place between Alan and his loyal assistant Duncan. Alan reported that in 2 days he would take Felicia to the second northern fortress and test her abilities. Duncan was surprised by the Duke's decision. Duncan's objections were met with refusal by the Duke. He did not listen to his assistant. Duncan reminded Alan that the fiercest battles were taking place in the northern direction near the second fortress. Alan stared out the open window and thought endlessly about his decision. The Duke turned to Duncan and informed him that he would personally accompany Felicia. At that time, Felicia was enjoying her new room and soft new little bed. After the experienced excitement, the girl fell into a deep sleep very quickly. 2 days flew by unnoticed, and early in the morning the carriage, accompanied by the Duke, set off for the battlefield. The Duke on an incomparable horse accompanied Felicia. The Duke tried to tell the girl about monsters and the bloody war. Felicia listened carefully to Alan's words. She was very scared, but she didn't show it. The carriage, accompanied by the Duke of the Northern Lands, was moving towards the battlefield. Felicia was in her carriage and drew terrible pictures of a bloody battle in her head. A terrible battle on the northern border of the empire continued for several days in a row. Everything around was sprinkled with the blood of glorious warriors. The Duke confidently proceeded towards the northern fortress. Felicia confidently followed Alan. Terrifying screams reached the child's ears. Felicia stood before a tall stone staircase. Felicia understood perfectly that this was the only chance to change her destiny. The girl was in a very determined mood. The Duke could not keep up with Felicia climbing the high steps. Felicia saw war for the first time in her life. Together with the Duke, she towered over the battlefield. Monsters and warriors were all mixed up. Felicia saw the whole necessity of a mage's presence. The girl leaned over the battlefield, holding tightly to the stone walls of the tower. Felicia closed her eyes, trying to focus on her abilities. The Duke watched the child closely. It seemed that Felicia was calm. Felicia understood that this chaos must be ended. The girl stretched out her arms, trying to create a magical mana. Magic swirled in the child's hands. Felicia began her work. A mage's abilities are determined by their magical abilities. The level of knowledge and abilities of Felicia was very low. The flow of mana through the girl's hands was weak. Felicia focused all her talent in her hands and directed the stream of magic into the very inferno. Alan raised his head and tried to make out the suddenly appeared storm. Felicia closed her eyes and tried to focus on her magical abilities. Monsters in the form of fierce wolves howled, raising their terrible muzzles to the sky. The warriors looked at the sky. They were horrified by what was happening. Felicia's eyes were bloodshot. The girl was completely immersed in creating the antidote monster. The little Felicia succeeded. The ferocious monster of justice emerged from the ball lightning. Felicia immersed herself completely in the mysterious magic and controlled the monster of justice, trying to save the northern lands. The Duke of the North, Alan Hayes, smiled. He perfectly understood that the girl had coped. Alan picked up the girl in his arms. Felicia was happy. She realized that she had saved the warriors and the northern lands. Alan proudly held the sorceress in his arms. Felicia clung to the mighty shoulders of the Duke. She was agitated. The girl did not understand how Alan would treat her. Alan Hayes, the ruler of the northern lands, holding the little sorceress Felicia in his arms, stood proudly at the very edge of the high fortress. Felicia was frightened. The girl clung tightly to Alan's neck and, together with the Duke, watched what was happening below. Monsters in horror were leaving the battlefield. People gazed in rapture at the young savior. Felicia was happy that she was able to save the northern lands. The girl smiled. The warriors chanted and greeted the sorceress. Felicia looked at the Duke. The girl was waiting for Alan's decision. She still did not know whether the Duke would allow her to stay in the castle. The Duke lowered Felicia onto the stone floor and looked at the child very tenderly. The Duke patted Felicia on the head and for the first time called the girl by her name. Felicia was very happy about this. The northern estate of Duke Alan Hayes was magnificent. Felicia became the favorite of the servants, and everyone vied to please the girl. Felicia's pockets were always full of candies and various sweets. Everyone remembered that triumphant victory of the brilliant young lady. First and foremost, Felicia became the brilliant mage from the Grey family for everyone. Only one Duke was constantly dissatisfied and ordered his servants to fatten up the thin girl. Felicia was happy. She had never received so much love and care before. Loyal Duncan tried to spend more time with Felicia, playing various games with the girl. Felicia also fell in love with Duncan and always treated the man to delicious candies. Duncan did not hide anything from the young sorceress, and since the monster attack continued and the war was not over, Duncan had problems with the fourth northern wall. Felicia listened carefully to the stories of her loyal assistant. Duncan, in turn, informed the little mage about the problems at the front. Felicia could not stand aside and offered her magical assistance. Duncan could not resist such an offer, but suggested that Felicia conceal this information from the Duke. On the fourth northern wall, the situation was dire. The brave warriors were unable to cope with the massive influx of monsters. Everyone was waiting for reinforcements from the center of the northern lands. The Duke was supposed to help his loyal warriors. The wounded youth awaited the appearance of the sorceress like no other. Felicia Gray was already on her way. Felicia, accompanied by Duncan, appeared on the northern fourth wall. The girl approached the battlefield and carefully examined the positions of the warriors and monsters. The situation and deployment of forces on the battlefield were dire. Felicia noticed that the soldiers were not keeping up with burning the bodies of the monsters. Felicia did not ask Duncan's permission and went to help the fearless warrior. The warriors were surprised by the appearance of the mage. Felicia was filled with joy. The girl was glad to help in the struggle for the lands. Felicia focused on her power, and the magical mana sparkled in the hands of the sorceress. Felicia directed all her efforts to fight against the huge body of the terrible demon. Burning the demon turned out not to be a very difficult occupation. Felicia felt great. Suddenly the girl heard human groans and turned around to look. Under a pile of fallen monsters lay a boy. Felicia stood next to the child and did not understand whether he was alive or dead. A tormented and exhausted 13-year-old boy lay under a pile of defeated monsters. Felicia leaned closer to the child. The girl realized that the boy was alive. Felicia began to pray to all the gods in the world. She perfectly understood that a doctor was urgently needed. The boy's face was wounded, and he himself was barely breathing. Felicia tried to pull the young warrior out from under the pile of bodies. And when she succeeded, Felicia carefully examined the boy. The girl tried to bring the boy to his senses and shook him by the chin. For a moment the child opened his eyes and looked attentively at his savior. At that moment, Felicia realized that it was none other than Stanley standing before her. The main character of the novel, Stanley, lay before Felicia Gray. Stanley rose. He saw the impending danger. The fearless warrior rushed to defend the young lady. Felicia, with her red eyes, saw the approaching monster. In 1 second, the sorceress tried to deal with the monster. But the agile Stanley abruptly pulled Felicia and saved her from the monster's powerful blow. A terrible monster was approaching the girl. Stanley and Felicia looked at the approaching danger with fear. A huge, terrifying monster loomed over the defenseless children. Felicia understood that Stanley would not be able to protect her now. The monster clenched its fist tightly, striving to deliver a devastating blow. Felicia pulled herself together and raised her hand, trying to create magical energy. Mighty and magical mana poured from the girl's hand. Felicia entangled the monster with her magic, and the monster was defeated. Felicia sat next to the boy and spun the monster, extracting magical mana from her palm. Felicia dealt with the monster and again turned her attention to Stanley lying nearby. She gently raised the boy's head, trying to bring him back to consciousness. But Stanley could not open his eyes. He was unconscious. Felicia must save Stanley at all costs. She sadly leaned over the child. 2 days later, the rescued boy lay on a soft bed and was coming to his senses. Stanley was sleeping peacefully. Duke Alan Hayes provided a separate bedroom for the brave boy. The doctor carefully examined the boy and delighted Felicia by informing her that Stanley was not in any danger. Felicia did not want to leave Stanley alone and settled comfortably on the edge of the bed. She looked at the boy with a tender and kind gaze. Stanley was handsome and pleasant. Felicia remembered the story of the boy's birth. The novel stated that imperial blood flowed in Stanley's veins. Stanley is an illegitimate son. His father came from the imperial lineage. Stanley's mother was a commoner and concealed the boy's birth. Stanley had a hard time. He was constantly threatened by danger. That's why Stanley's mother had to flee and hide her son. But the imperial guards constantly followed on the heels of the woman and her son. The mother tried to hide the child, but every year it became more and more difficult. One terrible night, the guards were very close, and the mother said goodbye to her son, asking the child to run away. Stanley watched his dying mother. The child could not hold back tears. Stanley bid farewell to the bloodied mother, and he decided to run. The boy ran without sparing his legs. Through tears and darkness, Stanley made his way through the dark, terrifying forest in the hope of finding salvation. The northern lands turned out to be a saving hope. Stanley knew that no one would look for him on the northern outskirts of the empire. Stanley had a talent for swordsmanship, and the Duke decided to train with the boy, developing his gift more and more. That's how Stanley's life journey was described in the novel. Such a difficult childhood for the main character. Felicia continued to keep watch by Stanley's bedside. She watched the boy carefully, afraid to disturb his sleep. But Felicia's fatigue made itself known, and the girl fell asleep on the bed next to the sick boy. Time flew by unnoticed, and the main characters simultaneously came to their senses and woke up from their sleep. Stanley was horrified by what he saw. He looked at Felicia as an enemy. Felicia was also surprised by the boy's reaction. Stanley did not understand how he ended up in the castle and could not remember at all the girl from the battlefield whom he had so skillfully saved from the approaching monster. Felicia tried to explain to Stanley what he was doing here. But Stanley did not want to listen to Felicia at all and loudly protested and pointed Felicia to the door. Stanley could not contain his anger. The rays of the morning sun illuminated the northern castle of Duke Alan Hayes. Outraged by the taunts of an unfamiliar girl, Stanley sat on the bed. Felicia continued joyfully telling Stanley about his appearance in the castle. Unnoticed by the children, the enraged Alan Hare appeared on the room's threshold. Felicia and Stanley watched the Duke closely. Alan shouted loudly. He was not happy with the appearance of an unknown boy in the house. The children watched the Duke attentively and did not understand the adult man's claims. The Duke leaned over Stanley and began to scrutinize his face carefully. Alan informed Felicia that the boy was definitely not from the northern lands, and the child's origin was unknown. Stanley said that he works for a mercenary squad and ended up on the battlefield fighting monsters. Felicia listened carefully to the boy's story and was very surprised that Stanley did not know who he was talking to. Felicia whispered in his ear that standing before him was none other than Alan Hayes, the Duke of the Northern Lands. Stanley opened his eyes in surprise. He was sure that he would be kicked out and not given the opportunity to stay in this wonderful castle. But Alan's decision surprised everyone. He allowed the boy to stay and gave him a separate room. Felicia was very happy with this decision. The Duke once again lifted Felicia into his arms and carried her down the corridor. The maids were very glad that the Duke had become so attached to the girl. The Duke carried Felicia in his strong arms, and at that moment the girl was very happy. For Felicia, finding Stanley in the castle was very important. The girl's face radiated happiness. Felicia understood perfectly well that it didn't matter how Stanley treated her. The most important thing was that he would now be taken care of. Stanley must grow up to be a normal person, since he must fall in love with the main heroine and save the world. That's why Felicia was very pleased with the Duke's decision. The Duke continued to carry Felicia in his arms, carefully listening to the girl's chatter. Stanley lay in his new room recalling his terrible past. The boy remembered his mother's bloodied body and the words spoken by the dying mother. The woman asked Stanley only one thing: the boy must survive. Stanley struggled to reach the northern town. The main thing the child understood was that in this northern city, he would not starve to death. And Stanley started working. The only place that hired him was a mercenary squad. Stanley carried out minor errands for mercenaries, but these errands were not always kind, and very often the enraged mercenaries would beat the boy. Stanley's body was mutilated from constant beatings, but the child endured. He remembered his mother's words that he must survive no matter what. Stanley lived. He endured broken flower pots and broken picture frames, every time enduring pain and humiliation. Stanley slept on the straw and covered himself with a tattered blanket. The boy grew up, tempering his character and seeking advantages in his situation. And there were advantages, and most importantly, he was able to earn money. Stanley began to take part in mercenary military campaigns and began to improve his sword skills. No one gave Stanley a weapon. He had to obtain his sword in battle. Stanley fought on the battlefield alongside a squad of mercenaries until the order to retreat was given. The army rushed towards the walls of the 4th Northern Border, but the soldier blocked Stanley's path and threw him into the very bosom of the enemy. Stanley found himself among the ministers. But this did not worry the boy. He grabbed his sharp sword and accepted the fight. But strength left Stanley, and the wounds gave no rest. Stanley was slowly dying, hearing somewhere very far away his mother's voice, "You must live." That's why, opening his eyes, Stanley didn't understand what had happened. The boy was in a beautiful room. He saw a lovely girl who was sleeping peacefully next to his body. He watched the beautiful girl and did not understand what had happened. Stanley did not believe what was happening. He had never in his life seen anything more beautiful. Distrust, that's what Stanley felt towards Felicia. Stanley believed that the girl didn't know grief and troubles. That's why Stanley was so rude to Felicia. Felicia understood everything, but decided not to interfere with Stanley coming to his senses. Felicia brought Stanley tea, trying to get the boy to talk. Felicia sat in an armchair with a cup in her hands and watched Stanley closely. Stanley was rude. He stared intently at Felicia, considering himself the lady's new toy. At the threshold of the room, a doctor appeared. Felicia politely greeted the doctor, offering to carefully examine the boy. Stanley refused to be examined in Felicia's presence and asked the girl to leave. The doctor opened his suitcase and proceeded to examine the patient. Stanley unhurriedly unbuttoned his shirt. The doctor began examining the injured body of the child. Felicia stood behind the doors, waiting for the doctor. The inspection lasted a very long time. The girl could not find a peaceful place for herself. Stanley's role in the novel was initially insignificant. He was supposed to be a loyal comrade and friend of the main heroine. Stanley's examination was over, and Felicia's thoughts were interrupted by the doctor. The doctor reported that Stanley's condition was stable, but he was concerned about the old wounds on the child's body. The doctor told everything he saw. Felicia listened carefully to the doctor. A few seconds after hearing it, Felicia abruptly flung open the doors of the room. Ignoring the doctor, Felicia burst into Stanley's bedroom. Stanley froze in surprise. Felicia nervously asked to show Stanley's wounds. Felicia, without waiting for permission, shoved her little hands under Stanley's shirt. She lifted up his shirt and saw old wounds and burns on the boy's body. Stanley pushed Felicia away, not understanding what was happening. Felicia fell noisily to the floor. Stanley was scared for the girl and looked at Felicia with a frightened gaze. Felicia looked at the boy with frightened, tearful eyes. Stanley was very frightened for Felicia. He went down to the floor after the girl, trying to help Felicia get up. Stanley, feeling ashamed of his actions, inquired how the girl was feeling. Felicia was interested in only one question: where did Stanley get such scars from? Stanley said that in the mercenary squad they did not respect weaklings very much and tried to make Stanley stronger. Recounting his childhood, Stanley's gaze was very stern. Having gotten confused by what was happening, Stanley completely forgot to take the pill prescribed by the doctor. Felicia listened carefully to Stanley's story. She perfectly understood that as the author of this novel, she was to blame for such a terrible childhood of the child. Felicia threw herself around Stanley's neck, trying to apologize to him. The main heroine created such a terrible childhood for the boy with her own hands. Felicia continued to gently hold Stanley by the shoulder, continuing to look at the boy with a guilty gaze. Stanley, like a true hero, bravely endured all his hardships and cares. Felicia continued to blame herself for what happened, but she knew for sure that in the end, everything would be fine. The girl promised Stanley to show care and compassion. Felicia held Stanley's wounded hands as tears welled up in her eyes. Felicia shrank modestly into a ball. She could not explain her behavior to Stanley. Stanley touched Felicia, trying to wipe the tears from the girl's face. At that very moment, Felicia raised Stanley's face with her own hands and looked straight into his beautiful eyes. She asked Stanley to never hurt or torment her. After that, the girl began to laugh loudly. Stanley clearly didn't understand anything and started acting like a boor again. Time flew by unnoticed. A beautiful bouquet adorned Felicia's room. Felicia was doing everything possible to build a relationship with Stanley, and now she was rushing to treat the boy to some delicious cookies. Felicia took on the full care of Stanley. It was she who began to teach the boy literacy. Stanley began to perceive Felicia as his closest friend, and Felicia continued to take care of the boy's health, pushing him to see the doctor. She took care of the main character as best she could, and at one point Felicia decided that the time had come to tell Stanley her story. Stanley sat in a soft armchair and listened carefully to the girl. Felicia claimed that she was Stanley's older sister. Stanley looked at Felicia with a smirk, continuing to chew the delicious cookie. The boy interrupted Felicia. He could not understand why Felicia called herself the elder sister. It was evident from the girl that she was no more than 10 years old. Stanley was carefully examining his newborn little sister. Felicia smiled. She could not tell Stanley that she was a wizard, but finding a suitable pause, Felicia admitted that she was from the Grey family and was a mage, and in this northern castle she was there for its protection. Suddenly, at the doorway of the room appeared the faithful assistant Duncan. He demanded that Felicia immediately appear for the defense of the second northern fortress. Felicia obediently left her seat without contradicting Duncan. Stanley did not want to let Felicia go. He took the girl by the hands and held her tightly. Felicia tore her hand away and with the words, "This is my duty," tried to leave Stanley. Stanley shouted loudly. He did not understand how this little girl could protect an entire city from monsters. Stanley shouted at Duncan, making no distinction for age. Stanley continued to defend Felicia. No explanations that Felicia is a mage and must bear her cross to the end could influence Stanley. Duncan tried to explain that Felicia would not be alone, but Stanley continued to hold the girl. He held Felicia's slender hand tightly. Felicia was frightened for Stanley. She was afraid that the enraged Duncan would expel the boy from the castle. Felicia explained to Stanley that she herself had agreed to such conditions. The girl is not being forced by anyone. Felicia explained that Duke Alan needed a mage, and in exchange for his kindness, Felicia provides magical services. Stanley was looking closely at Felicia, trying to understand the whole situation. Felicia repeated that Alan Hayes's castle had become a home for her only because of her magical abilities. Alan Hayes gave the girl shelter, and until Felicia turns 18, she will live in the castle. The more so, the Duke treats Felicia wonderfully, and he always accompanies her in any battle. Stanley understood perfectly what Felicia was talking about. He himself was forced to struggle for the opportunity to eat and sleep. Felicia told Stanley that she was an illegitimate child, and her family had decided to send her here. Felicia listened to the rustling behind the doors but continued telling her story. Stanley understood that he was unable to stop the girl. He wished her luck and saw Felicia to the door. Felicia said goodbye to Stanley and asked him to be sure to complete the treatment he had started. Behind the doors of the room, Felicia was awaited by the Duke himself. Alan Hayes looked sternly at the child, but he could not resist and picked up the girl in his arms. Felicia, sitting on the Duke's arms, apologized for her tardiness and tried to explain to the Duke why she was so worried about the boy. Duke Alan Hayes, his assistant Duncan, and the powerful mage Felicia Gray were leaving the castle and hurrying to battle the monsters. Time passed. Battles flew by one after another. Felicia's magical powers grew stronger, and Stanley's wounds healed. The children found a common language and constantly spent time together. Stanley understood that his wounds had healed and there were no reasons to stay in the castle. Felicia noticed changes in Stanley's behavior. The boy was completely healthy and ready to leave the castle. Felicia understood perfectly well that the Duke would not leave Stanley in the castle. On one of the beautiful days, the maid informed Felicia that Duke Alan Hayes wished to see the girl. Felicia hurried to the Duke's office. The Duke informed Felicia that they had a serious conversation ahead. In the office, the Duke had a truly expensive and businesslike atmosphere. Felicia stood opposite the Duke and was ready to listen attentively to her mentor. The conversation turned out to be not simple. Felicia listened carefully to the Duke. Alan was asking about the rescued boy and what Felicia knows about his origins. Felicia could not tell the truth, but Felicia thought that the Duke had found out everything himself. The Duke was perplexed. The only thing he knew about the boy was that the child was an orphan and survived by running errands for a group of mercenaries. Felicia was glad that the Duke did not know about Stanley's imperial origin, but Alana Hayes was interested not only in the boy but in Felicia herself. Alan frankly did not understand what this girl was like. He saw her completely different in the castle. She was a naive little child, but on the battlefield she was rational and cold-blooded. Felicia listened attentively to the Duke, not taking her beautiful eyes off him. Felicia thought that the Duke wanted to send her home, but in Alan's hands was a document confirming Felicia's right to reside within the castle walls. The Duke informed the child that he did not intend to expel Felicia, but on the contrary, he wanted to keep her in the castle and continue her education. For Felicia, such a decision by the Duke was a gift. She knew that the Duke was hostile towards the imperial family, and perhaps Felicia would become an instrument of revenge in his hands. The Duke continued his dialogue, and he made one more request to Felicia, or rather, it was not a request, but an order. Meanwhile, in the hands of the Duke was a list of crimes committed by mercenaries on the lands of the Fourth Tower. Felicia carefully studied the list of violations. The Duke informed his ward that it was necessary to restore order in these lands and deal with the aggressive mercenaries. Felicia carefully studied the document. She realized that Stanley was from this very unit. The fireplace burned with a bright flame, warming the entire Duke's study. The Duke informed Felicia that she must temporarily lead the soldiers from the fourth wall. Felicia was glad to carry out the Duke's order. The next morning, a beautiful carriage sped towards the fourth wall. Felicia watched the fallen snow from the carriage window with excitement and amazement. Stanley sat with a disgruntled look. He was offended at Felicia for the girl not warning him about the planned trip. Stanley's head was splitting from Felicia's joyful laughter. Felicia, on the contrary, was very pleased with the journey. She once again reminded Stanley that she was a mage, and the fourth wall could not cope with the monsters without her services. Stanley was watching Felicia closely. He was in awe of her beauty. In his eyes, Felicia was the most beautiful girl in the entire empire. Stanley could not understand how this tiny girl could handle the monsters. He pictured bloody scenes of a bloody battle in his mind and could not believe in the girl's abilities. Felicia was drawing a snowman on the window and at the same time questioning Stanley about the mercenaries. She childishly inquired about the brutal killers, while at the same time worrying about Stanley's life and asking him to conserve his strength. Stanley could not figure out Felicia. He did not understand why she cared so much about him. He thought that she probably knew about his origins. Stanley looked out the window with a serious expression. Felicia continued to interrogate the boy about the hierarchy of mercenaries. Stanley couldn't stand it and told Felicia that there was no hierarchy. There are only the weak and the strong. If the opponent is weak, the mercenaries dominate, but if the opponent is strong, the mercenaries are afraid and retreat. Felicia pondered for a few minutes. But then the carriage filled with children's laughter. Felicia realized that she would very easily put the rampaging mercenaries in their place. The beautiful view from the carriage window lifted the travelers' spirits. Stanley did not know why Felicia needed information about mercenaries. Felicia informed Sten that she was sent by the Duke himself on a great mission. Suddenly the carriage stopped and Stanley nearly fell at Felicia's feet. Felicia looked sharply out of the window and joyfully announced that they had arrived at their destination. The fourth northern wall of the Duchy of Hayes greeted guests with a noisy crowd. Felicia hurried to carry out the Duke's errand and noticed that the carriage was too high. Attentive Stanley stopped Felicia by grabbing the girl's hand with his hand. The boy supported Felicia, did not let her fall. Stanley carefully stretched out his arms, trying to help the little girl get down. Felicia was very surprised by such an act from Stanley. The girl did not expect such behavior from the rude boy at all. Children's hands joined and Felicia began to descend. Stanley did not believe Felicia and her selfless kindness, but he had to thank the girl for her care. That's why Stanley began to care for and protect Felicia. Soft and fluffy snow lay on the roofs of northern houses. Felicia and Stanley stood side by side and looked into each other's eyes. Stanley gave himself a word that he would be a faithful friend to this kind girl. The doors of the main military headquarters of the Fourth Wall were closed, but this did not prevent Felicia and Stanley from meeting with the Commander-in-Chief. The Commander-in-Chief loudly read out the order of Duke Alan Hayes and could not believe his ears and eyes. Felicia was persistent and stubborn. She tried to prove to the Commander-in-Chief that Alan Hayes with his seal of the Duke confirmed the order. But the Commander-in-Chief's distrust was caused by the age of the envoys. He leaned towards the girl and reminded her that Felicia and Stanley were still just children. Felicia once again reminded the chief about the Duke's seal, and also reminded everyone around that they would face consequences if they did not carry out Alan Hayes's order. Felicia introduced herself solemnly, informing those present that she, the mage Felicia Gray, had received an order from the Duke to bring order to the Fourth Northern Wall. After much persuasion, the Commander-in-Chief believed Felicia and gave permission to carry out the Duke's order. Stanley watched from the sidelines. Felicia invited Stanley to follow her. The boy followed Felicia without objection. Felicia bid farewell to those present and set off to carry out the order, and her first task was to deal with the group of mercenaries. Felicia walked confidently along the rows of shops. The girl turned her gaze toward Stanley. She asked where the mercenaries were gathering. Stanley reported that the main gathering point was the beer hall by the north wall. Stanley was puzzled. He did not understand what Felicia wanted to do. Felicia decided not to tell Stanley about the Duke's order. The only thing she said was about the intention to pass a fair sentence on the criminals. Stanley definitely decided to go with Felicia. The boy perfectly understood that you can't leave a girl alone. Felicia was glad about this decision. She knew for sure that it's better together than alone. Stanley loudly commanded Felicia forward and led the girl after him. The children confidently headed towards the beer bar to meet the ruthless group of mercenaries. People turned to look at the passing children. No one could believe that Felicia was the Duke's trusted person. People whispered behind the children's backs, but confident in their righteousness, Stanley and Felicia moved on. Felicia could not understand why the Duke had sent a child and not an adult to bring order to the Fourth Wall. But it was useless to ponder this. At the moment, Felicia was concerned with another question. What punishment to choose for the mercenaries? The punishment should not be too lenient and should make the mercenary reflect on their behavior. Detention and torture as one of the options. The captured mercenaries must realize all their sins. They must fear and know that for their actions they will receive a terrible punishment. Felicia asked Stanley what the most terrible punishment for a mercenary was. Stanley didn't think long and informed Felicia about such a punishment as cutting off a hand. Felicia shuddered slightly at what she heard, but realized that if this punishment for the mercenaries' crimes would be justified, then it made sense to punish people in this way. Amputation of limbs is a very effective disciplinary measure, although quite bloodthirsty. The villagers gathered in the central square. Stanley and Felicia tried to get to the center, but an adult man blocked the way for the children. Stanley very rudely stated that before him stood a trusted person of Duke Alan Hayes himself and demanded that Felicia be admitted immediately. Felicia tried to smooth over the conflict and began to smile sweetly. Felicia proudly walked through the crowd into the center of the square. Stanley obediently followed Felicia, trying to disperse the agitated crowd. Suddenly, a local resident ran up to the girl. The woman was very frightened. Stanley tried to shield Felicia from the peasant woman, but the girl rejected the defender's help and listened attentively to the woman. The woman known as Charlotta tearfully begged to save their village from the crimes of mercenaries. Charlotte shook Felicia by the shoulders, asking for help and protection. The woman convulsively told about all the crimes of the mercenaries. Felicia listened carefully to the woman, promising to definitely figure everything out and punish everyone. Felicia and Stanley continued their journey further. Charlotte looked at the little savior with hope in her eyes. At this time, the Duke's warriors tried to hold back the mercenaries brought to the square. The strongest and most hardened criminal sat on the ground in front of Felicia. He told the girl that he was a warrior who had fought monsters. Felicia listened carefully to the mercenary's speeches. The criminal was struggling out of the guard's hands, loudly shouting about his virtues. The mercenary tried to break free from custody, continuing to present himself as a hero. Stanley, surrounded by a crowd, watched what was happening. Felicia closed her eyes, trying to gather all the magical mana in her hands. Felicia spread out her palms. The magical power of the mage flowed from the girl's hands. The entire area was covered in the golden flame of retribution. Stanley watched what was happening with his mouth open in amazement. The most ferocious criminal was gripped by fear and horror. All his strength evaporated in an instant. The remaining associated mercenaries were gripped with horror at everything that was happening. Felicia continued to use her magic, raising her little hands high. A 13-year-old girl, the illegitimate child of Count Grey Felicia Grey, stood before the most bloodthirsty criminals and did not allow them to rise from their knees. At that very moment, everyone present in the square felt the invisible presence of Duke Alan Hayes himself. The mercenaries were pacified, and now Felicia could calmly read out her decision. The document with the crimes of these people was in the girl's hands. Surrounded by locals, Felicia began listing all the crimes committed by the mercenaries against the local population. Stanley watched Felicia. He saw her magical abilities for the first time. He could not understand only one thing: for what purpose Alan Hayes kept the girl by his side. Stanley remembered how once he had seen a magician, but that magician was very pitiful compared to Felicia. Felicia continued to read out all the crimes committed by the mercenaries. People watched Felicia closely and whispered among themselves. Stanley began to understand why Alan spoiled the girl so much. The Duke planned to use Felicia's abilities for his nefarious purposes in the future. Stanley continued to watch Felicia. Stanley understood that most likely he would never see the girl again. After today's trial, Felicia would rise to a new level. Felicia raised her finger up, drawing the attention of the mercenaries and surrounding people to the fact that she was ready to read out the sentence. Felicia pointed a finger of her hand at the mercenary and stated the first version of the punishment. Then she put on an innocent look and informed about the second option for punishment. After that, Felicia looked at the mercenaries with a questioning gaze, demanding them to make a choice. The mercenary was angry. He did not want to choose between limb amputation and a solitary battle with monsters behind the fourth wall of the fortress. Mercenaries tried to defend themselves and find justifications for their inhumane actions. Felicia, surrounded by disgruntled villagers, listened carefully to the mercenaries' justifications. But the girl hurried to remind the criminals of the agreement. Felicia reminded about the reward received for services rendered in battles with monsters. The girl also reminded about the concluded agreement with Duke Alan Hayes on the issue of protecting the imperial lands. Confident, Felicia demanded to make a choice between punishments. Felicia began to notice a drop in temperature. The girl started to freeze. Stanley continued to observe what was happening when suddenly a familiar cloak flashed past his face. The hand and cloak of Duke Alan Hayes flashed before Stanley's eyes. The cold completely enveloped the girl. Felicia was so engrossed in the process that she did not notice the Duke appear behind her back. Felicia turned back and saw Alan. Alan smiled as he looked at little Felicia. Duncan, the loyal assistant, greeted the girl, peeking out from behind the Duke's shoulder. Felicia once again did not notice how she found herself in Alan's strong arms. The mercenaries continued to sit on the cold ground awaiting their sentence. Felicia was glad to see the Duke, but she did not understand why Alan Hayes had made this journey. Felicia was having fun in the Duke's arms, but soon she came to her senses. The girl told about 2 types of punishments and the choice offered. The mercenary continued to spout nonsense in his defense, but the Duke ordered that both punishments be applied to the mercenaries. Felicia was horrified by what she heard, but the Duke firmly told the girl that mercy is useless in this world. The decision was made, and the Duke hurried to leave the village square. Alan held Felicia tightly in his arms, continuing to explain to the girl why he had acted in that way. Duncan joyfully greeted the Duke and Felicia. Duke Alan Hayes, his ward Felicia Grey, and Duncan were leaving the village. Duncan was having fun, enjoying childish amusements. Felicia was interested in the reason why the Duke came to the fourth wall. Duncan explained to Felicia that the Duke was worried about the girl, but Stanley did not believe the loyal assistant at all. Stanley claimed that the Duke was most concerned about carrying out the order. Felicia watched the argument between Stanley and Duncan. The girl did not like it at all. Duncan once again confirmed the theory about the Duke's anxiety, and he went to buy hot drinks, leaving Felicia and Stanley alone. Felicia waved to Duncan, following him with her gaze. The girl raised her hand up and asked Stanley to help her build a snowman. Stanley did not refuse the girl, and the snowman was almost ready. Felicia pretended that nothing was happening and continued making a snowman. But Stanley perfectly understood that today they would part ways, and this beautiful and caring girl would leave him forever. Stanley shyly asked Felicia if she would visit him. Felicia was perplexed. Stanley repeated his question once again. Felicia listened carefully to Stanley. The girl said that she would definitely visit Stanley. Joyful Felicia promised the boy that she would come to him every day. Stanley was furious at such words. He did not want pity for himself. He asked again whether Felicia would come to visit him as his friend. Felicia rounded her eyes in surprise. Stanley continued to insist on the word friend. The boy found it important to know and understand that Felicia was his friend, and the girl who had taken pity on the injured child. Felicia looked at Stanley, who had turned away, with understanding. Stanley stood with his back to Felicia and pondered his future. Unexpectedly, Felicia took Stanley's hand in hers. She turned the boy towards herself and said very warm words. Stanley took Felicia's warm words in his own way. He was surprised by such tenderness. Felicia continued to hold Stanley's hand and look at the boy with a tender gaze. The children stood next to each other and held hands. Felicia promised to visit Stanley. Stanley, in turn, promised Felicia to definitely visit her at the castle. Felicia perfectly understood Stanley's words. She knew that in order to get into the castle, Stanley had to climb the career ladder. Stanley was in a very determined mood. Gazing into Felicia's eyes, Stanley promised that he would definitely come to her castle. Felicia looked at Stanley and knew that it would be like that. She believed him. Felicia knew that Stanley's future would be wonderful. He would become a very successful person. And he will meet his love. Stanley will have a happy family. The children were saying goodbye to each other. Stanley held Felicia's hands. The children looked at each other with tenderness and sadness. The parting scene would never have ended if Duncan had not returned with a hot cup of tea in his hands. A wonderful end to the day. Tea has been drunk. Snowmen have been completed. Several years later, the northern lands of the domain of Duke Alan Hayes. Felicia continued to master the art of magic. But the great sorceress could not cope with the endless cold in the northern lands. 18-year-old Felicia Gray was freezing. Another battle with monsters and a completely inexperienced new warrior. Behind Felicia stood one of the newcomers, a soldier loudly shouting and demanding protection from Felicia. Felicia, as if nothing had happened, looked at what was going on with complete calm. Mastering magic perfectly, Felicia easily banished monsters, saving novice warriors from deadly wounds. Monsters scattered in horror, and those who fell under the effect of the magic beam fell motionless to the ground. Felicia understood the reaction of the inexperienced warriors and tried to protect and save them. She wanted to calm this little soldier too, but the fear of monsters was very high. Felicia sadly watched the new little soldiers. Near Felicia on the battlefield was also the main hero Stanley, the illegitimate heir to the imperial family. Stanley reached adulthood, and at the moment the young man turned 19 years old. Felicia could not take her eyes off Stanley. It took several years of hard work, and Stanley towered over a pile of defeated monsters and fallen warriors. Stanley was impeccable, insanely handsome and very intelligent. Felicia looked at the young man with pride. Stanley became a true warrior, and most importantly, the young man fulfilled the promise he had made to Felicia. Stanley studied and fought, striving to gain the Duke's favor. Stanley went through a large number of battles. He fought on equal terms with the strongest warriors of the northern lands. And most importantly, he earned the Duke's trust and the opportunity to visit the castle unhindered for meetings with Felicia. Let's return to the battlefield. Felicia continued to stand in defense of the inexperienced warriors. An 18-year-old girl claimed that inexperienced warriors need to get used to blood and the horrors of battles. Stanley was angry and grinding his teeth. The argument between the young people continued. No one wanted to give in. Life in the castle and on the territory of the northern lands continued. Felicia understood perfectly that the time was coming, and the plot of the original story would continue. Stanley had to meet his love. Stanley did everything to ensure that the Duke himself was involved in his upbringing, and Alan Hayes tried to instill all his knowledge and skills in the boy. Stanley became a very significant figure at the court. Most importantly, Stanley was valued in the army. The most worthy warriors bowed their heads before Stanley. But the development of the real plot of the story was hindered by Duke Alan Hayes. Felicia sat in a comfortable chair in the Duke's study and listened to Alan's proposal. The Duke's proposal threw Felicia into confusion, and the girl turned her head away so as not to embarrass the Duke. The Duke proposed to the girl to become her father and adopt Felicia. Felicia pondered the Duke's proposal. The Duke awaited a response, but at the same time Alan suggested to Felicia that they leave the castle. Felicia was perplexed and could not immediately respond to the Duke. Alan closely watched the reaction of his ward. Felicia sat proudly on the chair. She was ready to voice her decision. Felicia refused to become the Duke's adopted daughter and change her surname. The Duke accepted the girl's decision with dignity. After what he had heard, Alan handed the letter to Felicia. The girl was very surprised that during the entire period of her absence, not a single family member had inquired about her situation. Felicia remembered how easily the family had sent her to the northern lands, and how she suffered from such a harsh decision of the family. Felicia looked at the envelope with curiosity. The Duke, turning away to the window, informed Felicia that he could completely destroy the Grey family. Over the past period, the Duke has found a huge amount of compromising material on Felicia's family. But Felicia was too kind. The girl calmly familiarized herself with the contents of the letter. She informed the Duke that the family's only request was confirmation of Felicia's death. The Duke calmly let Felicia go, asking her in parting to call Alan Papa. The girl withdrew to her room and reread the letter once more. Felicia was stunned. The letter stated that her father, Count Grey, was in critical condition, and the family needed to take care of the inheritance, for which the Grey family required confirmation of the death of Felicia Grey. Felicia remembered how as a little 10-year-old girl, she was sent to the unknown northern lands with one small suitcase, and for the entire period of time only one letter. Felicia could not believe how indifferent she was to her family. Reading the letter, the girl remembered her brothers and sister. She perfectly understood that she could take advantage of the Count's offer and take revenge on the family for the insults. But Felicia did not want to end up in prison and be executed. She desired a good end for herself and for the story. Felicia was completely immersed in her thoughts. Felicia was brought out of her reverie by a light knock on the door. Stanley stood outside the bedroom door. Felicia was glad to see her friend. The girl invited Stanley to go into the room. She remembered how they used to chat for hours on end sitting on her bed. But childhood was over. Stanley was furious. He learned that Felicia was going to leave the castle. Felicia looked at the guy with wide-open eyes. She perfectly understood that Stanley was waiting for a wonderful story and a new meeting. Felicia squinted her eyes and with a slight smile confirmed the news of her departure. Stanley continued to stand in the doorway, not daring to cross the threshold of the room. Felicia understood perfectly well that they were no longer children. A beautiful young man stood before the girl, handsome, intelligent, and brave. Stanley was not happy with Felicia's decision to leave. Leaning over the girl, the young man demanded that she state the date of her return. Felicia silently listened to Stanley's complaints. She could not say anything in response. Stanley stood in front of Felicia with a sad look. He shook the girl by the shoulders, telling her that she had to return to the castle. Felicia remained silent in response. The girl knew perfectly well that they would never be together. Stanley continued to hold Felicia by the shoulder. The main character could not believe Felicia's words. The girl looked at Stanley with tenderness and tried to explain to him that they were already adults. Stanley did not want to believe Felicia's words. He could not believe that Felicia would dare to visit the capital. Felicia reported that first she would settle matters with her family, live in the capital for some time, and then head south to a warm place. Stanley tried to calm down. Felicia looked at Stanley again and reminded him of his age. She told him that the time had come. The parting was inevitable. Stanley meanwhile recalled his childhood and snowmen. It was then that he decided he would always be by Felicia's side. Felicia understood why Stanley was so reluctant to let her go. He knew that in the capital they were still looking for him and wanted to kill him. The imperial capital is Stanley's native home, but a home where he is not welcome. Felicia gently hugged Stanley by the cheeks, trying to convince him of her rightness. But stubborn and uncompromising, Stanley continued to disagree with Felicia's departure. Stanley's eyes are filled with sadness. Felicia had not seen Stanley like this for a very long time. The girl was watching the young man closely. Suddenly, a terrible cold attacked Felicia. The girl froze terribly. Felicia got distracted looking for a warm blanket. Stanley turned to Felicia and could not contain his emotions. He hugged the girl tightly and pressed her to himself. Stanley whispered in Felicia's ear that he would definitely come to the capital. Felicia was enveloped in warmth and care. The girl did not understand. It seemed to her that she had fallen into another world. And Stanley continued to say that he would definitely come to Felicia in the capital. Felicia remembered this promise when, long ago in childhood, Stanley had already promised to come to her castle. Felicia realized that Stanley was not joking. Stanley looked very seriously and sternly at the beautiful Felicia. Felicia knew for sure that Stanley would keep his promise and come. The next morning, the courtiers and servants went out to the central square of the castle. The carriage was brought. Lady Felicia was leaving the northern lands and bidding farewell to all the inhabitants of the castle. Several suitcases were waiting to be loaded into the carriage. Alan Hayes saw Felicia off with best wishes. The girl was saying goodbye to Alan as if he were her own father. Alan let his ward go with a light heart. The Duke handed the girl an accompanying letter and reported that the Hayes' house in the capital is at her full disposal. Alan Hayes wished Felicia a great journey. Felicia waved her hand joyfully, bidding farewell to all the courtiers of the castle. Tears of sadness welled up in Felicia's eyes. Alan Hayes followed the carriage with a piercing gaze, trying to say something after it. But Felicia heard nothing, only looked out of the window at the departing Duke. Felicia was upset by her departure and by the fact that she did not hear Alan's last words. The carriage raced to the capital of the empire. Meanwhile, in the capital, at the Gray family home, two brothers were dividing the inheritance. Carter Dalton, who recently visited his father, reported the poor condition of the Count, and since the father did not have time to leave a will and distribute the inheritance, the joyful elder brother Carter decided to take on the responsibility of distributing the inheritance of the Gray family. Hearing such a remark, the younger brother Darren Dalton coughed and barely held back laughter. Darren looked at Carter and marveled at his brother's audacity. A young man reminded his brother that without a will, the inheritance goes to one of the most powerful mages in the family. Carter went berserk over that, and he could not answer anything except that he understood this perfectly well. At this time, the conversation of the two brothers was perfectly audible to their mother, Lady Dalton. The lady held on to the round door handle and was in no hurry to open the door. The lady froze in contemplation. She perfectly understood that the brothers were dividing the inheritance. The argument was heated. Carter did not restrain himself and shouted loudly at his brother. The argument was interrupted by the mother bursting into the dining room. She asked the children not to speak so loudly about the inheritance, and in general, as the Count's wife, she would take care of everything. The youngest son arrogantly told his mother that she had no right to interfere in matters of inheritance. Carter confirmed his younger brother's words and reminded his mother of her recent affair with a young lover. The mother responded sharply to her younger son, putting the arrogant youth in his place. And she rebuffed her elder son, saying that her dalliances on the side in no way affected the issue of inheritance. The butler stood at the threshold of the dining room. The servant interrupted the conversation of the relatives and announced the appearance of a guest on the doorstep of the house. The Countess and her sons were shocked by the appearance of the young guest on the threshold of their home. The butler announced the name of the guest. Darren was struck dumb with surprise. The Countess did not understand what was happening. She nervously looked at her son. The girl who was the illegitimate daughter of the Count and was raised in the attic. She could not return. The Countess, turning away to the window, could not believe that the girl had survived. Darren nervously finished his tea. Felicia did not make her relatives wait long for her appearance and entered the hall without an invitation. Carter was horrified by the appearance of his adult sister. All relatives were looking at Felicia with their foul mouths open. Felicia smiled. The girl was in a very determined mood. She held in her hands a request for confirmation of her death. and without hesitation she informed her relatives that she was alive and well. Clapping her hands, Felicia continued to mock her relatives. The brothers could not believe their eyes. Felicia did not hide her joy at such a reception. Felicia lay in the guest room, reflecting on the future after the family gathering had ended. The room provided to Felicia was not bad and looked decent. At night, Felicia could not sleep. The girl sat recalling all the horrors of her stay in this house. Felicia did not notice how morning came. The maid entered the girl's room without knocking, and with a sharp movement placed the water for the morning toilet on the table. Felicia leaned over the water and realized that the water smelled terrible and had already been used by someone. At that very moment, the young girl realized that all the horrors of staying in this house awaited her ahead.